Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started in a second, but we'll just give folks a few minutes to join. I'll repeat this a few times because I know folks are probably starting to stream in, but please let us know in the chat your first name, where you're from, favorite shows at the moment. Let's try to crowdsource a little bit of a new content for everyone. And we're going to be using the Q&A feature to ask questions today. So that way everyone can see them. So make sure that you're using the Q&A. And just so you know, the webinar is being recorded and will be emailed to everyone who registered. So if you have to drop off early, do something else, live your life, we will make sure that you have a copy of the webinar in your inbox shortly. So welcome to How to Think Like a Producer and Create a Win-Win. We are going to get started in just a second. I see folks starting to stream in. We would love if folks could introduce yourself in the chat, first name, where you're from, and your favorite show at the moment. And it doesn't have to be a serious show just because we're going to talk about serious newsmaking here today. Welcome, welcome. Oh, I see we have folks from all over joining us. I'm just going to repeat, we're encouraging as we go along, we will have a Q&A session at the end. We would love folks to use the Q&A feature to ask questions. That way we'll be sure to track all of the questions and hopefully get them answered. That also allows for everyone who's chatting with each other, which I love to see in the chat, to be able to also see commentary back and forth, and our team can manage questions. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm already seeing some bonding over shared shows that people are sharing in the chat. That's great. Thanks so much for participating and welcome. First name, where you're from, favorite show at the moment in the chat, and we will get started in a moment. For those who are just joining, welcome to How to Think Like a Producer and Create the Win-Win. We're going to get started in just a second. We're asking folks to drop their names, where they're from, and their current favorite show in the chat. Also, as a reminder, please use the Q&A feature to ask your questions. We'll have some Q&A at the end. That allows us to make sure we're managing questions. And thanks so much. And the webinar is going to be recorded. We'll send that out after we're done so that everyone has a copy. So don't worry if you need to leave us early or if your question doesn't get answered, we'll make sure to cover as much as we can. And seeing that we have a pretty good crew, I think we're going to get started. So welcome everyone to How to Think Like a Producer and Create the Win-Win. I'm Christian LoBue, Executive Vice President of Campaign Strategy here at M&R. I'll be your host along with Ann Thompson, who will introduce herself in just a minute. I wanted to share a little bit about myself and the work we do here at M&R. Prior to joining M&R, I was the Chief of Campaigns at NARAL Pro-Choice America, which is now Repro Freedom for All. In that role, I designed and led integrated campaign strategies, leading the organization's political, government relations, and organizing strategies. Prior to that, I was the Chief of Staff and Head of Campaigning at the Voting Rights Lab, where I led the organization's approach to strategy, movement mobilization, and communications in our fight against voter suppression. And prior to that, I led the in-state and district team for a member of Congress for almost 5 years. So what that really means, just in sum, is that I have spent a lot of my career and time thinking across a lot of campaigns about how to get my own issue or my person or my candidate or narrative out into the world. And that usually means getting involved with media, on TV, on a podcast, but if a tree falls in the forest, does anyone hear it? So I've spent a lot of time thinking about this issue. And that means I'm particularly thrilled that Ann has joined our team and is bringing her incredible smarts and broadcast media savvy. So in leading M&R Win, our integrated approach to campaign strategy and design, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what we do, then we're going to dive right into the topic. So We are an integrated campaign team, really thinking and working and partnering with groups for campaign strategy and execution. We really leverage our deep expertise across so many issues, which we'll talk about today, in support of campaigns and causes across the progressive ecosystem. One of my sort of like thrills about this work is that our product, the thing that we are most proud of, is your victory. So if that win is shifting narrative, if it's educating the media and the public, or bringing partners into alignment, our team has the tools and the strategies that can do it, and we are ready to dig in with you. To that end, I just can't overstate my excitement about Anne joining our team earlier this year, bringing her deep expertise in strategic comms to our clients and their work. And as you'll see in a second, she has really kind of seen it all. And so that is particularly useful given the wide swath of issues and organizations we partner with at M&R. And I just can't wait for you to meet her. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Anne, to introduce yourself. Please take it from here.
Oh, thanks so much, Christian. It's really great to be here at M&R, particularly under your leadership. So I really thank you for that. And it's really great to be here in this space with all of you. I feel like I'm with my people, seeing all those names and places and orgs that people are coming in from. Like all of you, I've spent a lot of my career at the intersection of advocacy and media. I led comms around raising the minimum wage at the National Employment Law Project, ran a rapid response video production team at the DNC for President Obama's re-election campaign in 2012, and built a team at Move On that created over 1,200 online videos, generating more than 85 million views on a range of issues. So we were a bit busy. But today, I want to focus on what I learned during my time producing at MSNBC for Up with Steve Kornacki and Crystal Ball's web show, Crystal Clear, because I think there are some rich learnings for advocates who want to get onto TV, radio, and podcasts. I really want us to get into the shoes of a producer, understand their challenges and what they need, so we can be better partners to them, so we can better support them to make great programming. And I think, like the title of the webinar says, the point is to create a win-win here. So, speaking of getting into a producer's shoes, here I am about 8 years ago, and you can see my shoes are sneakers because I'm traveling across the country with all that darn stuff, a tripod, a camera, a light, a suitcase, all of it. And I think the photo captures the life of a producer, carrying so much, both literally and metaphorically. And there's a lesson in it, because if you're a comms professional who wants to get through to a producer, you've got to get past all that stuff they're carrying. But I'll say, another thing I noticed in this picture is the smile on my face, because even though I was carrying all that stuff around, I really loved being a producer. Getting out in the world, talking to people, making connections, creating stories. And I mean, sitting at a desk at 30 Rock was pretty cool. You know, I'm not gonna lie, it made my day to cross paths with SNL stars in the elevator at the salad bar or whatever. That was cool. But really what was most rewarding was getting out and finding a story powerful enough to make air, and then maybe even make impact on policy. And I think a lot of producers are like me. They want to make a difference and they need your help doing it. So, how can you help a producer out? What does a producer want? What does a producer need? So, I want to share this checklist of things that I needed as a producer so you can be an amazing partner to all the overloaded producers out there. And while this is my list, I do think it's pretty applicable to the experience of other producers. But before I go through it, I want to tell you about what motivated me to create this list. When I was a producer, I would get pitches for causes I cared about, from people I cared about, from my friends. And I really wanted to help them, but I'd read this pitch and I'd say to myself, do you even watch our show? Like, there was some good content in there, but it wasn't TV-ified, and I would have to do all this legwork myself to get it from what they pitched me to be able to be in a place where I could pitch it to the rest of my team. So in hindsight, this is the checklist that what I would have given to those friends so that they could pitch me better and partner with me better and probably get some more of their segments on television. So number one, if you're pitching me, like I just said, the first thing I need for you to do is be on brand for my show. Watch my show, know the recurring segments, know the host, know what their flair is. I'll be at this time preoccupied trying to cover all the news of the day. I'll be juggling a ton of stuff. So if you can use your expertise to help me cover the day's headlines in an even better way, please help me do that. That's so useful. That's my priority number one. And like a pitch you email over is fine, but it's even better if you can send a link to a story that's run somewhere. It's already been fact checked. There's a headline I can grab and turn into a graphic. As a producer, I also want to break news, shape the debate, not just be like an observer of it, maybe even change the course of history. That would be awesome, right? So if you can help me do that, that's gold. And one way you can help me do that is by helping me land high-profile interviews, decision makers, newsmakers. It's right there in the name, newsmakers. Next, there might not always be a new development in the story that the issue you're tracking, but if there's there's interesting new data on it and it's a hot topic in the news right now, that could help me land a segment on your issue. But remember, TV is not text. That's not enough. Please give me some engaging visuals, photos, videos, audio, B-roll, sound bites to go with it. And say you have a video of a press conference. If you want to send that over, that's fine. But I'm not going to have time to watch, 60-minute press conference. What would be even better for you to do is choose that precise 10-second soundbite that you'd recommend the show play. And if you can transcribe it for me, that's even better because I have to transcribe every single piece of video that goes on our show. So I have to do it no matter what. And also if I'm working fast and I can see the text of what you want to put in, I can evaluate it quicker and not click over and watch and da-da-da-da. All the tabs, everybody knows all the tabs. It's hard. Put it there right for me in the email. So that really goes a long way in getting the content you want on television. As a producer, I also want help from advocates finding compelling stories, compelling personal stories. And when I say compelling, I mean exceptional, extraordinary, the needle in the haystack. You know it when you know it when you see it. That's the kind of thing that you can help me find. And finally, engaging conversations. So when you pitch a guest for our show, make sure your guest that you're suggesting is seasoned, that they've gone on a bunch of shows already to practice. There is no show too small to practice your conversational skills or to reach an audience that you're trying to reach. So I really encourage you to think big about where you can get practice so that when you're pitching for television, you're ready. Okay. So before we move on, I just want to tell a story that I think encapsulates all this. Pull back the curtain a bit. So I think I mentioned that before coming to MSNBC, I worked on minimum wage campaigns at the National Employment Law Project. And one of their focuses, of course, was extending minimum wage and overtime protections to home care workers. When I was working at MSNBC, it was in Obama's second term. And as the days ticked by, it became increasingly urgent for Obama to deliver on the campaign promise that he made to finally extend minimum wage and overtime to these workers, mostly Black and brown women, who had been purposefully excluded from these protections for more than half a century. So I was thinking, how can I get this issue on TV? How could I make the story fit our mandate to cover the big political stories when it wasn't making a ton of headlines? And how could I make it fit Steve's brand? So Since Steve is a connoisseur of political history, I dove into the archives and I pulled out stories about the unlikely alliance between Shirley Chisholm and George Wallace that formed in support of home care workers. And then I pulled out the shenanigans that the Nixon administration did afterwards to undo all that. So along with all these fascinating tidbits that I was pulling out from everywhere, I included in my email pitch to the team because, yes, as a producer, you are always, always pitching. I think I pitched maybe 5 to 10 shows, 5 to 10 stories a week, 52 weeks a year. That's 250 to 500 pitches a year. You're always pitching. So I included in my pitch some archival photos, like the one you'll see on the screen, and video of Obama on the campaign trail in 2007, doing laundry and mopping floors side by side in SEIU home care worker. So it was enough. It was enough to get Steve's attention. And he added another angle to the story to make it even more relevant to a broader audience. He framed it as a story about whether elected officials deliver for the coalition of voters who put them in office. So that is how we tailored the piece to Steve's expertise and brand. But there is another piece to the story. There was another key player here, the advocates. They were the ones who first put on my radar Obama's delay and made a compelling pitch about the time was ticking down. This was urgent. This was about presidential politics. So they put it on my radar. And as I was producing the segment, I was trading rapid fire emails with the folks over at PHI and National Employment Project, and they were helping me fill in the gaps as I went, as the minutes ticked down to air, because you're always in the final minutes. So that's the story behind the 4.5-minute essay that Steve did on whether Obama would extend minimum wage and overtime protections to home care workers. And in case you're wondering, yes, months later, President Obama did extend that protection, and these workers now must be paid minimum wage and overtime. Kind of sounds like a small victory, but it's still a victory in terms of what they should be paid and what value they do provide. But I just want to reflect and say that while I produced a lot of television, a lot of hours of TV at my 3 years at MSNBC, these 4.5 minutes were my proudest because I was able to weave together my interests as an advocate with Steve's expertise as a political historian. And I'm really proud of how I was able to adapt and create a win-win.
Man, and I've heard a bunch of your MSNBC stories. I can't get enough of them. It's very popular here at M&R, but that might be my favorite because it just sort of tells the story so beautifully. So if we are putting our producing hats on, we're approaching this work like a partnership, we should dig into how we can make a producer's work easier. How can advocacy groups and folks like the organizations that I know are represented on this call use that same savvy that Anne was talking about and those same sort of skills and tips to help producers achieve their goals. So we're going to go through some broadcast appearances from M&R clients, present and past, that help us see what this looks like in action. Okay, so let's take this interview with Jennifer Levy, who was able to go on Rachel Maddow on MSNBC as our first example. The GLBTQ Legal Advocates and Defenders, or GLAD, were one of the legal organizations that were leading the challenges against the Trump administration's ban on transgender people serving in the military. Following a ruling by the Supreme Court that allowed the ban to take effect, Jennifer, who is GLAD's lead attorney in the case, was booked on Rachel Maddow to discuss the ruling and next steps for the organization and the coalition's legal strategy. Jennifer could speak to the issue both from a legal perspective, of course, given her expertise, but also the firsthand impact of experiencing increased discrimination because of her lived experience as a transgender person. This opportunity, of course, was not teed up overnight. We'd spent time with GLAD and their team building to this moment, positioning the organization as experts with both MSNBC producers and others. So when this case made news, GLAAD was well positioned to serve as an expert resource in a breaking news moment, similar to the way Anne talked about that sort of like rapid iteration and relationship she had with advocates in some of her previous examples.
Great. And next, I just want to assuage your worries if you're feeling a little nervous out of that last slide. You do not need to be arguing a case at the Supreme Court to make news that shows will want to cover. There are other ways too. So here's an example. When I worked at Move On, I was regularly struck by how a group of people doing an action in their community tied to a hot national topic could end up on the local evening news. So when people show up in their communities with some organization and support, they can draw cameras. And as you can see in this picture, there's not a zillion people there, right? But there is a news crew, and that organizing did end up on the local evening news that night. So you can be part of the big news stories of the day, or you can try to break some news. And so this is what this next example is about. I did mention earlier that I worked on efforts to raise the minimum wage. I think I've established that. So back in 2011, I called it laboring in the wilderness because minimum wage, from my perspective, was not a huge part of the national discourse at the time, but the presidential election was. So I thought, what if I can insert the minimum wage into the election conversation? And I should say, I'm not working at MSNBC at this time. I'm working at the National Employment Law Project. So I'm an advocate at this point in time. So I thought, can I get minimum wage into the thing that everyone's talking about, the election? So I got myself on a rope line at a Mitt Romney event in New Hampshire, and I asked him his position on minimum wage. And he made big news by telling me and my cell phone camera that as president, he would support raising the minimum wage and indexing it to inflation. So I had this really newsworthy soundbite on my phone about the leading presidential candidate of the Republican primary. But the next order of business for me was to make reporters care, right? Because those are two different things. So over the next few months, I pushed this soundbite at every opportune moment I could find until I was finally able to drive a news cycle around the Republican presidential candidates and all of their positions on the minimum wage. This came after Romney had said he wasn't concerned about the very poor, and there was a deluge of reporting about, for the first time in the cycle, about what these candidates wanted to do around improving the lives of low-income folks. Wow. Okay. So at that moment, really leaned in, really capitalized on that news, the news cycle, and was able to finally give my soundbite wings, and it just took off. So here you see it on the Rachel Maddow show. And I will say, the thing that I am very proud of too is like, the next year, when Obama was delivering his 2013 State of the Union address, he did call for raising the minimum wage with inflation and cited Mitt Romney's support of it here on the campaign trail as a way to pressure other congressional Republicans.
So good, Anne. So it doesn't always have to be, though, breaking news, you on a rope line, doing all of the things. That is not always how we're going to get ourselves coverage. It doesn't always have to be breaking news and bird dogging candidates, right? Because that's not all of the work. So let's take this example from our partners at the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley as an example. In this example, this is an incredible moment of leveraging compelling data to tell a story, create a media moment, and elevate the information that is powerful for your work to drive sort of multi-level coverage. So OBI released a report on racial housing segregation across the United States, and it received pretty significant media attention across national and local print and broadcast outlets and social media. I want to highlight something about this data. It was a state-by-state scorecard, and that was a really big media draw. We worked with them to secure a segment on the report on CNN, and they also secured a mention in a segment on housing discrimination on Last Week Tonight with John Oliver. In addition, the report received incredible coverage from local media that dug into the really hyper-local findings of the report. I know you're like, John Oliver, dream hit. Yes, more. It's because this data was so rich, they were able to turn it into a national narrative story, comparative insight stories, state and local media hits. It was kind of like the perfect recipe for this kind of coverage. It was really driven by John A. Powell's compelling academic research. He's so well respected in this space, communicating pretty dense data in ways that related back to people's lived experience. So it was like this combination of a messenger and the data itself really allowed for a straight report on CNN, but it also then fit pretty seamlessly into a cultural discussion on Last Week with John Oliver. So this shows that it's pretty critically important to consider your broad and specific communications goals early on in the development of your reports and research, because we know that like comparative data, that kind of ranking state by state, right? States are so competitive, it sort of brings out the natural competition. That kind of stuff is like catnip for broadcast and for producers. So this next slide, these faces are probably familiar to quite a few folks on the call, and that is exactly the point of this particular example. So the Council on Criminal Justice convened a commission on incarcerated veterans that was led by former Defense Secretaries Leon Panetta and Charles Hagel, pictured here. They were booked to discuss the findings of a report that was released by the commission to raise awareness on the unique challenges facing veterans in the civilian justice system in order to build consensus for more evidence-based reform. Later in the webinar, we're going to walk through a snapshot media analysis. You'll see that having these kinds of current and former officials, they are so often sought out as guests and interviews on shows. So partnering with them, with folks like Hagel and Panetta, is a good strategy to elevate your work. Another way to think about this, and another way that we've worked with clients to leverage, these kinds of relationships, is to build a speakers bureau, right? That way you can utilize all sorts of different messengers with different types of credibility and exposure and platforms to bring your message to different audiences, including broadcast media. I know from seeing, the roll call in the chat that many of you have storytelling programs or are connecting with constituents, supporters, and advocates over shared lived experience. Obviously, I hopefully don't need to tell you what an incredible asset that is to this work, but it's really useful in a media context because we know through research that stories are often more compelling and impactful than the troves and troves of data that also proves that we are right on many and all things. In this example, after Congress passed a bill that would change the way the federal government oversees the Bureau of Prisons, Adam Clausen, who's an advocate who works closely with our client, Families Against Mandatory Minimums, went on NPR's 1A to discuss federal prisons and the law's potential impact. Adam is a formerly incarcerated individual who is working for legal system reform. So his relevant lived experience helped to tell a really compelling story beyond the data and beyond statistics, which made him a perfect messenger for the opportunity. Yeah, and while we're on the podcast train, let's talk about podcasts. I would love to see if anybody has a second in the chat while you're also taking notes and probably multitasking and doing the millions of things that you're doing with the webinar. Who's a podcast fan? What podcasts are you listening to? I am constantly streaming podcasts in the background while I do just about everything in my everyday life, because not only are they entertaining and informative, but from a strategic side, podcasts are a great way to have deeper conversations and reach really specific audiences. In this example, Insha Raman, director of Vera Action, a C4 working to reframe the conversation about crime as an election issue and offer proactive and affirmative ways for candidates and elected leaders to talk about safety, was booked on Sunday Civics with L. Joy Williams. Why was this such a powerful component of their strategy? Well, Vera Action's own polling indicated that Black voters are particularly aware of, invested in, and persuaded by safety and solutions-oriented policies and candidates. So because this conversation was intended to be a real deep dive into policy, messaging strategy, political strategy. It was the perfect place to have that kind of spacious and engaging conversation. And it was a place where we wanted the audience to hear it. They could hear it, right? They could receive the message. And Inch and Eljoy were able to have a deep and engaging and spacious conversation on the topic with an audience who is expecting just that, right? So you match the sort of opportunity with the platform. Podcasts and booking them can be a mutually beneficial and reinforcing affair as well. News Not Noise, a podcast hosted by Jessica Yellen, describes itself as having interviews with real experts and not pundits. In this case, we worked with Supermajority to provide expert, non-punditry conversation and commentary ahead of the 2022 midterm elections. Supermajority's focus on bringing women together to advance gender justice and leverage the power of women in elections allowed their ED to frame up not just the election, but the impact of the Supreme Court Dobbs decision, its intersection with voting rights, and longer-term organizing and voting patterns on our attacks on our fundamental freedoms, which obviously has inspired and motivated women around the country. So in one sort of package, one hit, we were able to push out data, message framing, and color commentary in one robust conversation. And I know you have some other thoughts on this and sort of how to wrap this part up yourself.
Sure. So, I mean, I think a lot of what Christian was just running through there were examples of how we couldn't be good partners with shows on the journalism, the broadcast journalism that they're producing. And I'll say, I mean, we're using that term broadly. There is like the language evolves, right? Broadcast is a bygone term almost. When I would walk into the control room at MSNBC, it would say on air. We weren't on air, we were cable. But anyway, it's a technical term, broadcast media, but we're using it as an umbrella for TV, radio, and podcasts. So as we were saying, we were helping those shows create good broadcast journalism. And I think one other way we can be a good partner to them is also to help them build their audiences, because not only do they want to make good stuff, they want a lot of people to see it, and they want to pay the bills and be able to keep producing their shows, excuse me. So a key imperative for our friends in the media is to grow their audience. So how can we help them do that? I mean, organizations can do this by serving as a champion for journalists aligned with your mission, or even just by uplifting good journalism about the stories you care about. Reporters are facing all sorts of challenges these days. So if you can help them by amplifying some of their good journalism on your social media platform, on your SMS, on your email, that goes a long way. You can also offer exclusives to shows that you want to support. Like if you have an exclusive that is rich, that's a value. So think about how you could use that value to provide it to a show that has been good to you, or it has been good to your issue. And then you also want to pitch stories. And I know this isn't probably how we always think, but you want to pitch stories for segments that could draw a large audience. Usually a segment that might have some entertainment value. Not always, and you want to be judicious with that, but it's something to think about.
Okay, so I want to shift gears. We're going to take a look at some data to back up all of these recommendations and all this conversation. And let's look at how broadcast media coverage is just currently playing out, because we can learn a lot by taking a snapshot of what the media is covering, who's doing the talking, and how it's being covered. This is the type of analysis that helps us guide our clients to the right opportunities for their communications goals. So for the purposes of this analysis, we picked a Tuesday a couple of weeks ago. We scanned 50 news media shows across TV, radio, podcasts to see what topics they were covering, what types of guests and interviews they were including, and where there were the most opportunities for advocates and impacted folks to be a part of the discussion. We scanned networks like ABC, CBS, NBC, all of the ones you could think of, probably some you would like to forget. And if a show or daily show wasn't on that day, like a Sunday show that isn't on Tuesday, we just looked at the next closest air date in order to include it in the analysis. As a refresher, because no one expects you to remember what was going on August 27th, because what is time right now and forever? Here are a few things that were going on. There was a new Trump indictment, the ongoing war in Israel and Palestine, US prisoners held by Russia were returned home, and attacks on voting rights in Georgia and Texas were headline news nationally and in those states. So it was not a slow news day. I don't think we really have those anymore, but it certainly was robust. So you can see here, when it comes to topics, the election is dominating coverage and is far and away the biggest topic of conversation with 40% of the segments. Of course, that is with good reason. We are less than 2 months from the most important election of our lifetimes. And so you'll see that this coverage coverage was pretty spread out across a number of other issues. The election is just really dominating the conversation. But who was doing the talking? So as you can see, reporters are doing most of the talking. The primary messengers on these shows are reporters, the folks who host them. That's at about 32%. You then see that it's followed by officials, elected officials. We sort of lump folks together, government officials, former folks. They're a really big chunk of the conversation at 21%. So if we go back to our example with Leon Panetta, right? Those kinds of folks are going to get calls, so they're an incredible asset to your work. Advocates make up about 10% of talkers, and impacted people and storytellers are even less at 7%. To put a finer point on it, in our analysis, that's 37 guests out of 185 total guests on 50 shows were advocates or sort of impacted people or storytellers. So you might be thinking, that's a bit of a downer. Like, ouch. You know, we have like so many shows, we have so much to say, we have so much change to make. But if you look at the range of topics that advocates and impacted folks are being brought on to discuss, there's some good data. They're being included in overall conversations about the election, of course, because that's the dominant sort of news of the day. But there are critical messengers on some of the most compelling pre-election messages, right? Because stories and issues move people, not the candidates themselves sometimes. And I'd note in particular that this group is talking about the issues that are driving votes and activating audiences. This is a good thing. We're focused on talking, right, about the things that we need to in this critical time period: immigration, the economy, repro freedom. So for the next part of our analysis, let's move on to reporting-driven shows to frame up a little bit of last analysis before questions. So I'll turn to Anne on this in one sec, but just wanted to share this piece of data because I thought it was really informative. Where we see advocates and impacted folks featured most is in original reporting. So that says to me that this represents a gold mine of opportunity. Places like PBS NewsHour, NPR's Morning Edition, NPR All Things Considered. You could be looking at my own phone right now. These are all the things that I read, listen to, watch. I know Anne has more to say on this point, so I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, so we're going to dig into the PBS NewsHour, right? Because wow, that was by far and away on August 27th, not representative of every single day of the year, but on the day that we took the snapshot, this was a really great show for advocates and impacted people. So what did it look like? So right here, we see sort of screen caps of the 6 segments or blocks from the PBS NewsHour that day. And you can see 5 of these segments feature reporters, and one segment there on the bottom left is an interview with a US prisoner who was returned home from Russia, joined by her husband. So we have mostly reporters, but we do have 2 impacted people featured pretty prominently here as well. Now let's go a little deeper. So in her segment on immigration policy, we have Laura Barone Lopez being interviewed by the anchor. But while she is in studio being interviewed by the anchor, she tosses to a soundbite, a 20-second soundbite that she recorded with the president of Forward US. So great. Now we have found 3 of the 8 advocates or impacted people who were on that night's broadcast. So where are the other 5? Let's look at this amazing package that Judy Woodruff did on accessible housing for people with disabilities. So this was a 10.5-minute package that tells a really powerful story of an exceptional residence in Missouri that advocates and people with disabilities came together to create. And it's a really great example of the kind of stories advocates like us can do more work to track down and pass along to shows. So we're going to do a little wrap up here before we go to Q&A. And I will just say, if there are 3 things that I want you to walk away with today, I'd want those to be, number 1, help a producer out. They're overloaded, so anything you can do to make their jobs better, faster, produce better journalism, it will pay dividends. Number 2, help producers better accomplish their priorities to help you better accomplish yours. Really get into their mindset and what they need and help them get there. And you can use that checklist I shared earlier in the webinar as a bit of a cheat sheet. And then finally, my advice from where I sit and how I see this data and all my experience being on shows, I would say, get on the phone, get out in the field, track down good stories, find those gems that you can pass along to reporters. As our media snapshot shows, advocates and impacted people featured most in original reporting. And your organization can get a ton of value out of a reported piece like the one we just took a look at from the PBS NewsHour. So, just to close right out before we go to Q&A, I want to point to Christian and my emails on the screen. You can shoot us an email, get in touch. As you can tell from my presentation, I like talking to people. And as a heads up, we will be posting the full results of the media snapshot on our blog. So stay tuned for that, more coming.
All right, so I think we're going to turn to Q&A. Just as a reminder, if folks could put your questions use the Q&A function in order to ask your questions. That way we can track them and make sure that they get answered. I see one question that we'll get started with, and then I think our team have called a few more from the chat. So the first question I see is, did we pitch John Oliver, or did they reach out to us because of CNN? Our team did pitch John Oliver, and just want to shout out OBI here. In particular, I think we have our OBI friends on the call, such incredible partners in this work that our team really loves working with across many, many different types of projects. My last webinar was with OBI. So particular fans here at M&R. I think in this particular example, high profile hit show, these kinds of hits, like really big ones on the shows that we all watch, show the power of research packaged with media audience in mind, and can really show like the snowball effect that can be created with really smart media strategy. It's really the component parts of like really great research, knowing your audience, knowing what you want to do with that research, and then applying it at different levels of media and trying to reach different audiences. So it was a really fun one. I know the team loved working on that one. We love our work with OBI, and who doesn't want to be on John Oliver? And I think we have a question in the chat. If the organization is just dabbling in media, could you expand on what some baby steps smaller or newer organizations could use, like sharing good reporting, or maybe how to use social media?
Sure thing. Well, I see Katie, I see you there. I've seen you on the local news, so maybe you're more than just dabbling. But yeah, that's a really good point. Like this is all really scalable to how big or small you want to go. I think if you're just starting, and if you are a more local organization, relationships is a really great place to start. just getting to know who are some of the reporters that you see out and about on the streets doing some of the coverage, uh, asking them. I mean, I know this sounds really crazy, but just like, hey, how can I help you? I think that was like sort of the theme of my presentation is like, and I sort of said, well, this is how you could help me. But I think probably that's a little bit different for all the different scenarios that folks work in here. So I think, asking people like, what can I provide you that would help make your job easier? What can I do to support you? I think it's a great question, in life. As far as baby steps on terms of sharing good reporting on socials, yeah, I mean, I think uh the beauty of this time, it's a hard time in media, but the beauty of this time is like all you need is a link. And it doesn't matter if it's from the New York Times or if it's from Patch or if it's from any number of outlets, like sharing that to your audience, putting it in your email newsletter, putting it, they will see where the clicks come from in their back end analysis. And I think that there's a lot of negative incoming at journalists. So where you can lift up good work, I think that will go a long way. So hopefully that's some good starting points.
That's great. Oh, this is a good one, Anne. This person says, I'm gonna ask the question that my boss cares most about. What are your tips for getting on Rachel Maddow?
Oh, yeah, we all love Rachel Maddow. We love getting on Rachel Maddow. It's one of my proudest moments for myself. I will admit it. Um, so, but it's hard. And here's what I would say. From what we looked at, like, so when Christian and I went through some examples of GLAAD getting on Rachel, and I went through National Employment Law Project getting on Rachel. In both of those examples, those were like pretty high profile news moments. That was news of day stuff, right? Or breaking news stuff. So I think that's really important. I think when we did the media snapshot, so when we looked at all those shows, all those 50 shows, um, that day, and her show is just on Mondays now, right? So it's only once a week. She had two guests on in her hour, and they were the North Carolina Democratic Party chair and a member of Congress, right? So high profile elected officials, that kind of thing. So that's one way in. That's another way in. Maybe, like we talked about earlier, you partner with those types of officials and they can carry your message. Another thing about her show, of course, is she does these, beautiful long essays that sort of take you on this wild ride related to the top story of the day. So like, can you provide some of those anecdotes? We were just talking about like a Patch story, for example, in response to Katie's question. I feel like Rachel Maddow is the person who'd be like, and this Patch article from San Gabriel, California. So like, yeah, just do you have any of those like rich tidbits that you could pass that could fit into her monologue, but maybe not feature your principle? But then one other piece I'd say from looking at digging into all those shows and where the advocates showed up is there's a lot of great shows out there. Um, Futuro Media, they have a show Latino USA that when we looked at it, they had a segment that featured gun reform advocates. Pacifica's Democracy Now! Had 3 advocates on that day. Tavis Smiley, Roland Martin, Dino Badala, all these folks had really good guests on. And I will say, this is a personal anecdote so that you'll know I'm old, but the first time I worked with Rachel Maddow was about 18 years ago, and she was on our Radio Row at the Take Back America conference. So she was a radio host back then, right? And now she's a much bigger Rachel Maddow with a much bigger megaphone. But all these folks who I mentioned, like they have their own megaphones too. And yeah, one day that they will move into her shoes, move into her slot as well. So I think there's strategies to get on Maddow, but there's also strategies to broaden your lens.
Great. We've had a few more questions come in, so we'll try. I'm keeping an eye on time. We'll try to get through as many as we can. We have one question from Alexis saying, as a producer, how do you want to be pitched and followed up with? I usually spend the most amount of time crafting strong subject line summaries, and then she tries to call as follow-up. So let's start with that one. How do you want to be pitched and followed up with?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think you're definitely doing the right things. For myself, I would say like it's the same in any kind of communications. Like people, you have to catch their attention right at the top, or else they scroll past your tweet, they scroll past your email. So I do think a sharp subject line is really important. Write it, like what I usually do is I write it and then I cut out like the 70% of it that's extra fluff and really get to the pith of it in the subject line and in that first sentence. Um, I think that calling can be good. I think I mean, this is hard to know from the outside, but if you can get a sense of the cadence of their schedule, right? So like at the time when I was producing with Abastu Kornacki, all of my colleagues, we had to submit pitches on like say like they had to be submitted by like 10 because it's a weekend show, Wednesday at 10 a.m. So like what was happening with every producer at like Tuesday at 9 p.m. at their laptops at home? They were all like, shoot, I need pitches. So like if you can know their cadence and know like if a show is going to run at 12 it's a daily show that's going to run at 12, they probably are having their editorial meeting and deciding the show rundown. That's like the segments that will come in the show, maybe at about 7, right? So you need to get your pitch in at like say 5:30. So just knowing the timing can help. Obviously, it could be a black box if you're on the outside, but like to Katie's question, if you actually ask someone, how can I support you? They might tell you like, oh, when's a good time to send pitches? XYZ. So that's what I would suggest.
Great. And we have another question. Are producers reading organizations' emails, newsletters, or social posts? Are producers reading those in your experience, Anne?
Well, I mean, yes and no. Like, I think the ones that you're definitely reading, I would say as a producer, there's some aggregation that helps you do your job. So, Tegan Goddard's political wire is a good one. The Hill has like they sort of have this good like breaking stories by top Senate, House campaign. Twitter is X is a good place to go to sort of like get synthesis. So what I would say, so I'm just kind of thinking out loud of like where I would go. So like I'd go to those news aggregators and then I would go to like the outlets that reported political news a lot deeper, right? The Post, the New York Times. And then where you're going to see the stuff from orgs show up is on X and Twitter, where they've had a really clever, pithy post. And because it was clever and pithy, it's been retweeted 1.4 thousand times and it's showing up in your feed. So I think it's like the hardest thing, right? To like write something short and pithy and powerful. But if you can do that, if you can do that for your tweets, if you can do that for your sound bites, if you can do that for your quotes that you provide in the press releases, that is how they're gonna like rise to the top and producers are gonna see them.
Great. We have a question from Christina. When you were a producer, did you ever provide feedback when you passed, if you were asked that question?
Not unless I had a relationship with somebody.
Mm-hmm.
Like if I was getting sort of like a mass email or whatever, I wouldn't respond to it. But there's but for people that you have relationships with and you want to build relationships with, making it more of like a two-way conversation, I think is really great. So I think if you can get to a level where you have a producer that you have like a good working relationship with, you will get to that level. And I remember telling folks like, it's not going to work here, but here's stand by. I think that next month when this happens, we probably have an angle, that kind of thing.
Great. And I think we have time for one more. And it looks like we have a question of some networks have central booking emails. Is that effective, or should we still be trying to get something to a specific producer? And if you could, just for 1 second, and maybe say just a little bit about selecting the best producers from all the different producer titles we all see, like senior producer, editorial producer, booking producer, etc.
Yeah, those are really good questions. Really good questions. So, and I think they're really good questions in part because there's not like a universal answer for it. It's like you got to kind of do some digging and you kind of always have to be refreshing what you know because, you know, there's several different models. Like while I worked at MSNBC, we had both models. We had models where like show bookers were largely driving the show. Then we had a model where the overall booking team was driving the network. So it shifts. I would say where I can be most useful in terms of your question is around the titles. So the booking producers are definitely the people who are in charge of getting the guests on for the most part. And if you're going to be on TV, you're probably at some point going to interact with them because they're the ones who are going to help you with the logistics and the prep questions, etc. But I think segment producers are really good. That's what I was. They're the people who are like writing all the things. Okay, give them like here's your pitch the segment. Okay, Anne, here's what you have to deliver. Okay, write all the things, find the graphic, find the video. And there's producers for that as well, graphics producers, video producers that are you're working in a team. But I think a segment producer is sort of like a really good person driving editorial like thoughts around a subject. So like if you send an email to a segment producer and you're like, hey, like, okay, definitely this is a good thing to do, right? If you get an article in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Politico, whatever, right? And so you've already got some third-party validation of the credentialing of your person. So you can send that article and be like, hey, you might want to be covering XYZ issue that was in the news. John Doe was quoted saying da 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 da. They're available this weekend, kind of thing. So if you send that, you could send that to a booking producer and a segment producer, but like a segment producer is the one who's going to get excited about, especially, I mean, not always, right? But if we have to draw lines, they're going to be the ones who are going to be like, yes, we have to cover this issue, and that's the person to cover it.
Right. Well, I think that was a really good one to end our time together. We just want to thank everyone for joining us today. As a reminder, a recording of the webinar will hit your inbox in not too long now. Thank you so much. Please reach out if we can be helpful as you all are mapping your plans both this year and beyond. Thanks so much for all you do. Take care.